Welcome everyone. We're really excited for the first ever Shifting in Action event. We're super excited to share the lived experiences of educators who this evening are implementing the Modern Classrooms project model here in Halton. First and foremost, we want to thank you for being here. We know this is a crazy busy time of year right now, midterms and whatnot, and a crazy year itself. So we want to thank you so much for trusting us with your time. We promise to make it worthwhile for you. Our job as shift coaches is to find and share ways of innovating in our teaching and learning, and the Modern Classrooms project does just that. We hope it speaks to you as it has for us. We think that you'll find it really appealing on a number of levels, and we're always here to support you along the way as you dive into the learning journey yourself. So tonight, we encourage you to keep an open mind with a how might we and a yes and attitude to what you're hearing as you follow along with us tonight.
Okay. So just before we get into it, we want to introduce ourselves. We are your shift team. For those of us joining outside of the school board, or if you're new to our board, the shift is an initiative within the Halton District School Board that aims to really stretch our edges and think about and consider and reimagine what school could be. So we love to play, try, fail, learn, and shift. My name is Rachel. And I'm joined by my amazing colleagues, Matt, who's going to wave to you, and Rebecca. And yeah, we're so excited that you're here with us this evening.
Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis, from the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis. These lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. My name is Rebecca McCrae, and my pronouns are she, her. I want to make this acknowledgement meaningful by reflecting on the recent apology from the Pope, where he apologizes for the suffering that the Catholic Church put on the Indigenous peoples. That is, that starting in the 1880s and for much of the 20th century, more than 150,000 children from hundreds of Indigenous communities across Canada were forcibly taken away from their parents by the government and sent to what were called residential schools. These children endured physical and sexual assault, and many died. They were malnourished and stripped of their culture and denied access to their families. The Truth and Reconciliation Council report concluded that the school system amounted to cultural genocide. In 2021, thousands of unmarked graves were discovered on the grounds of the former residential schools. The Pope's next step is that he will apologize to the Indigenous families when he visits Canada. While an apology is long overdue and is the first step, I hope the intentions of the Pope are to take action to reinforce and promote reconciliation. As a white person, I do not intend to speak on behalf of the Indigenous people, but rather strive to use my teaching tool as a way to amplify voices from these communities and take action wherever possible.
Okay, before we get into and dive into our content, we know that the chat is going to be fast and furious. So I just want to draw your attention to the Q&A feature that we've enabled for you this evening. So if you want to access that, if you have any questions as we're going through this evening, we encourage you to click on the activities button. That's going to be your triangle, square, and circle, and that's down in the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. Then you're going to select the Q&A, and then once you're in there, in the very bottom right-hand corner, you can click on Ask a Question. You can type your question in there, and then you can also take a look at the questions that are there. If someone's already asked a question and it's resonating with you and you want to hear the answer, you can upvote it by clicking on the thumbs up. So Make sure you're using that as we're going tonight. We'll take a look. Hopefully we're going to have a little bit of time to come back to these questions. If not, we will address them in some of our follow-up materials. We do want to just also point out, we're going to reserve the hand raising feature for our panelists only today, just to ensure that the conversation keeps flowing. So if you do have questions, make sure you're using that Q&A.
All right, so we are first going to turn it over to our two special guests from the Modern Classrooms, Emily Dia and Toni Rose Deanon. Emily Dia worked as a classroom teacher and instructional coach for the last 20 years. She currently spends her days as partnership manager for the Modern Classrooms project, supporting educators like us, schools and districts, reimagining the instruction with the Modern Classrooms model. Emily holds a bachelor's degree from Wake Forest University and a master's in learning and instruction from Northeastern University. And Toni Rose is a teacher by nature with 10 years of teaching experience in the middle school English in both public and public charter schools. She was also an instructional coach for an independent school. She started implementing the Modern Classrooms project in 2019 and has not looked back since. She's using the model with all of her learners of all ages, and she enjoys the ability to cultivate and nourish relationships. Welcome, Emily and Toni Rose.
Thank y'all so much for having us. Little sidebar before I give a quick overview of the model. Toni Rose was actually my mentor in the virtual mentorship program when I trained in the Modern Classrooms project. So it's a major full circle moment for us to be working together. And, yeah, being with all of you. So I'm like, it'll be on my best points for Toni Rose. But I'm going to give us like a maybe 12 to 15 minute overview of the model itself. And if you haven't already, please make sure that you watch our Edutopia videos. They're about 5.5 minutes long. The left video here is a secondary video. The right is an elementary. They really help you see the model in action if you're not familiar with what a classroom looks like. We'll jump right in. Rachel's going to be my slide DJ. So thanks, Rachel, for doing that. So we are an educational nonprofit, and we were started by 2 high school math teachers who were facing this image in front of us that we all face as educators. We have this wide range of learners in our classes. If you can click, Rachel, we have students who are on grade level or perhaps above grade level who are bored. We have students who are absent and frustrated and can't catch up. And certainly like my leaving the packet at the front desk for them to pick up was not catching them up, right? Like they were missing the instruction and that was not helping them. And then we've got students who are below proficiency who need more of us. They need more time in small groups. They need more time one-on-one. And they're feeling lost. And then that just leaves us as the educator feeling really frustrated and like we're failing our kids and ourselves. And our co-founders felt the exact same way. And they were like, there's got to be a different approach to teaching and learning that will actually let us differentiate. You can go ahead and click, Rachel. Instruction. Kareem Farah, one of our co-founders, says differentiation is the most overused and underutilized term in education. And I think he's right on there. And what I love about our model is that it really empowers teachers with the how to do these things. So we can go to the next slide. So our instructional model is grounded in 3 features: blended instruction, self-paced structure, and mastery-based grading or learning. And really, we're learning this all in a personalized program through the virtual mentorship program or the free course, however you want to access us. And none of these ideas are new in our field. However, all of these ideas are difficult sometimes to implement. I know I was totally on board with these ideas as an educator, but I was also like doing a million things in the day. And I was like, how am I going to implement this with 120 students? Like, I just can't imagine personalizing instruction for all those students. And this model really gave me the tools to do that. So I'm going to do a very quick overview of the components of our model. And we can start with blended instruction. So you can go ahead and click. In a modern classroom, blended instruction really means eliminating the whole class lecture or that like sage on the stage moment where we're delivering content to students. And then we're replacing that moment with teacher created instructional videos. So I want to be sure that we understand this doesn't mean like whole group activities don't happen in a modern classroom. Labs are still happening, debates are still happening, puzzles are still happening, problem solving is still happening. All the things can still happen. But we're really focusing the majority of our direct instruction time in the instructional videos, which frees us up as educators to really be working with students one-on-one and in small groups. During that time, we would have been delivering content. The other piece of the blended instruction is that students cannot access our instruction wherever they are at any time through our learning management system. So they can revisit our videos if they need to. They can also, if they're absent, catch right up. They can also, in the moment, pause us. They can rewind us. They can fast forward us if they know it already. All these ways that they're actually differentiating their own instruction, their own experience through the video. One of our mentors, Alora, says the model really allows students to have the very best of her, and I would totally agree. I think the model does. At least it made me feel like very connected to my students because of the time I was able to spend with them in a new way. Probably, you know, in the 18 years, it took me 18 years to find the model. It was really different before that. This is an example of a instructional video. So when we share the slides out, you can watch it by one of your HDSB implementers, Rachel. So we're talking, oh, here's some more. Krista's, this is awesome. You can see here, Krista's got her instructional video, but she's also got accompanying notes, so guided notes that students are taking along the way. And then you can see that her activity for this particular lesson was like a sort and find kind of activity, really hands-on. So we're talking about self-pacing. We're really thinking about self-pacing students within a unit of study, very specifically with a hard start and a hard stop. A lot of teachers also put in a midpoint, checkpoint. Some teachers even self-pace by the day, some pace by the week. But we're talking about students being self-paced within that unit of study, which is a couple of things for us as educators. It really allows us to take inventory of the gaps that are occurring in the unit. At the end of the unit, we can take inventory and then we can plan ahead accordingly. The second thing is that it also allows us to really attend to district pacing standards and to curricular guides. So we can still have that common assessment date that is expected of us, or we can still follow the pacing guide in a self-paced way. And then the second piece is that each lesson is classified as must do, should do, or aspire to do. So we want to think like our must do lessons is that most essential content that every student must know and be able to do in this unit. And then the should do and aspire to do's are those content or skills that some students will access. And then the third piece of self-pacing is progress tracking. So as a teacher, I was really all about this idea of student choice and voice and like leveraging choice boards and playlists and all the things, but I was having trouble keeping up with where students were in the context of those experiences. And the progress tracker was a total game changer for me in that way. So I could tell you every day where every student was along the course of the learning journey in the unit. Super important. So this top image is from your Karla. This is her pacing tracker. You can see that she's got on pace, ahead of pace, and a little behind pace. This is suggested pacings in her classroom, and you can see where the students are falling across that continuum in this little mini unit on identity. This kind of classroom progress tracker is a really effective tool for nurturing a culture of collaboration and revision. It also allows Karla as the teacher to take a quick eyeball and say like, ooh, look, that group of kids is all on lesson 2 and they might need some help. They've been there for a while. I'm going to start with them today. I'm going to pull them as my first small group. It also really empowers students to collaborate really organically, to say like, if Rachel and I are both on lesson 3, then we know we can work together on lesson 3. Alternatively, if Sheri's on lesson 4 and I'm on lesson 1, I can use Sheri as a peer expert and say like, how did you get through lesson 1? Can you help me out? As a resource in the classroom. This bottom image is a student-facing tracker that, that students are given in an art class. So this is a photography class mini unit on composition. All the boxes are hyperlinked. It's probably a little tricky to see. The different colorful borders are the lesson classifications. So the blues are the must-dos, and there's practice built in. You can also see he's got some shout outs in there, as well as like particular students that he's going to be working with. So just a little taste of some different ways you can approach progress tracking. All right, so when we're talking about mastery-based learning or mastery-based grading, we're really thinking about this idea that students progress in a unit based on their mastery of skills for each lesson. A teacher builds a mastery check or a competency check or a check for understanding for each lesson, and that is the ticket to move on to the next lesson. So in my previous practice, an exit ticket would just be like an end of day reflection. Everyone would do it at the same time. Everybody had the same reflection. In a modern classroom, the mastery check really is the gateway to move on. So you can't go on to lesson 3 until you master lesson 2. And the way that we know that is by establishing really clear criteria for mastery. So in a modern classroom, the teacher is very clear about what that criteria is and communicates that to the student. And then if that mastery isn't reached, the student is expected to revise and reassess and reflect. So for me, this was another huge game changer when I started using the model. I was very focused on retakes and reassessments at the summative experience at the end of the unit. And a lot of times by that point, several of my students, well, more than several, had not found such success in the unit, and it was like way too much for them to go back and relearn. But this model really allows us to intervene every step of the way and hold students accountable for understanding at every lesson. And that expectation to revise and reassess is really, really key. You can see here in this photograph that these two students are both taking a mastery check at the mastery check station in their classroom. They're taking 2 different lessons because they're on 2 different colors paper. That's how the teacher has structured that. The students in the back are doing an activity together. So there's a lot of activity and noise and energy in a modern classroom, lots of things happening at every pace of the way, but every student is ideally engaged at their own particular level. All right. So last little bit here is about research, and then we'll talk about our training. We are a research-backed organization, and we partner with Johns Hopkins University in the United States to do impact studies on both teachers and students. So I just wanted to highlight a little bit of our data here. This is a slide showing the impact on teachers in a control study with classroom teachers and modern classroom teachers who had completed the training and were implementing the model. The control teachers were people who identified as like having similar values and similar grade levels. They just hadn't done the training yet. You can see incredible gains with the control versus the modern classrooms teachers. And all of these are in the areas of differentiation. So I can catch my students up if they're absent. I can really serve the needs of the students in front of me. I can use data to really inform my instruction. And I'm really able to work closely with students in my class every day. I know in a typical unit, I would typically confer with like 3 or 4 students on a good day. In a modern classroom unit, I was conferring with 15, 16 a day. And just that incredible increase in contact with them was a game changer in terms of my understanding of them as learners and as humans, honestly, and our connection and our trust with each other. So that's just a snippet. The full report is available. It'll be linked here if you want to read it. And then this is a snippet about our long-term impact. So we are very curious, like once people are using the model, how it's feeling long-term. So once people have been implementing for a year or more, we like to ask them how it's going. And you can see that 86% of folks say they're feeling like they enjoy teaching more. They feel more optimistic about education as a field. They're more likely to continue in the career, 72% said, and then 95% said, you know, I'm gonna continue teaching this way. I'm not gonna change my practice now that I've learned this way of instruction. And the final piece of research that I'll share with you comes from one of our partner schools districts in Michigan, Concord Community Schools. They're a district who decided to train 60% of their staff over 2 years in the modern classrooms model. They were curious after that training and then a year of implementation, how it would go in terms of their math test benchmark assessment scores. And you can see like really striking growth in fall and winter proficiencies after the implementation of the model in mathematics classes. Really, this was during COVID, they were super surprised and super excited to see this outcome, and they're continuing the study this year. So that is a lot of content about us. I just have a couple more things to talk to you about with our training. So we'll go into that really quick. So we do have a free course. It's learn.modernclassrooms.org. It's going to be on the resource page of this slide deck, and maybe somebody could drop it in the chat as well. To date, we've had over 32,000 teachers globally complete this course. All the access to content and tutorials is there for you if you want to check it out. The virtual mentorship program is really just a more personal experience of that content. We can't give one-on-one feedback to 32,000 folks, but we can certainly do it with a smaller cohort of humans who are interested in learning. Thank you, Toni Rose, this model. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about the virtual mentorship program. And I just want to highlight that the program is not just for classroom teachers, it's also for instructional coaches and leaders. We have often instructional coaches who are looking to reimagine PD in their communities, or we have building principals who want to really experience what educators are experiencing in the program and really be able to support them in tangible ways. So any educator is welcome to attend the virtual mentorship program. And I would also say if you're here with a team or you're part of a team, like the virtual mentorship program can be great for teams to attend as well. You can co-create some of the content in the course. Really just creates incredible support after the course is over as you're implementing in your communities. So all of that context as we get into a little bit more. So when you're in the virtual mentorship program, you're going to create assignments for all 5 modules. You're going to learn about mastery checks, blended learning, self-pacing, a learning design plan in terms of what your classroom is going to look like, your LMS, all those things, all those incredible details. And then you'll finish the course by doing a mini unit. So 3 full Modern Classrooms lessons. And that will be the end of the course. The course runs for about 5 weeks long. The other cool thing, the reason it's called a mentorship program is that, and I mentioned Toni Rose is my mentor, it is a personalized experience. So you're going to be partnered with an educator who's using the model in their practice right now. If you're an instructional coach, you'll be working with someone who works with adult learners. If you are a classroom educator, you'll be partnered with someone in a similar grade level or band as you, and they're going to give you really specific feedback on what you create in the context of their expertise and their experience. So it's a truly collaborative, incredible experience. In my 18 years of learning professionally up until that point, I just had never experienced something so personal and so practical. Like, I actually made my first unit for August in the course. So it was so engaging, so practical, so personal. So that's the virtual mentorship program. And this is a picture of the feedback journal that you get. All right, next slide. I just wanted to share some feedback from people who have already completed the course from Halton. You can click through these, Rachel, really quick. We're not going to read them to you, but you can sort of scan. You might recognize some of these folks, scan their ideas here, but really good praise. And then the last thing I'll offer you before we get into our panel time is our commitment to teacher leadership pathways. So really, the idea is that we want to raise and elevate the voices of educators because you are our movement, you are our field, you are the foundation of it. And so we offer 2 credentialing pathways for you to consider if you'd like to explore those opportunities. The Distinguished Modern Classroom Educator is a micro-credential you can apply for after you've been implementing. You create a narrative portfolio representing some artifacts of your practice, reflecting on your practice. And then if you do earn that micro-credential, you can apply to be an expert mentor, one of those people who walks through the course with other educators. Our mentors are paid $50 an hour. They can set their own capacity. And most excitingly, they can support educators all over the world without leaving their community. You can still keep creating an impact in your own community while growing your leadership skills and supporting educators everywhere. So that was a very micro overview of everything that we do, but I'm so grateful to be able to share with you. And I think now it's time to hop into some Q&A.
Amazing. Thank you, Emily, for that whirlwind tour of MCP. We are now on to the rest of our panel. So before we introduce our panelists, thank you for all you who have signed up and submitting all your amazing questions in advance that you asked when you registered for the event. We hope that the majority of your questions will be addressed in the upcoming discussion and through in the Q&A feature that we'll address towards the end of the evening. We'll also be releasing an FAQ doc after the event tonight, where we hope to cover even more of the questions as well. So don't worry, we got you. In addition to Emily and Toni Rose, also on our panel, we are delighted to have 4 educators from right here in Halton, representing a cross-section of grade levels. We have Kristi Pocock, currently teaching grade 3, Karla McEachern, teaching grade 8, Caitlin Kemp, teaching grade 9 English, and Sheri Hill, teaching grade 9 Streamed Math. So, tell us a little bit about yourself. Why don't we start ourselves off by kind of paint us a picture. What does MCP look like in your practice and context? And what does a typical day look like in your classroom? So let's start with Kristi.
Oh, and we did, okay. Thanks, Matt. So I use MCP for math, and we start our day with an overview. I use both the whole class tracker and the personal game board for students. So as a class, I post the whole class tracker on the whiteboard, and students can use that to check their names for mastery checks. If they need to do a revision, their names are in yellow. And they also see where they should be to be on pace. They can see who the lesson consultants are. So those are people that they can go to ask questions. And it's also a place where I give shout outs to students who've accomplished personal goals or they've helped another student. From there, the students work independently, or they might partner or work with a group depending on where they are in the unit. And I physically moved to the Mastery Check table, and there I'm working with about 4 to 5 students at a time. And I'm addressing misconceptions in the moment as I mark their mastery checks. So typically the mastery checks are fairly short, 1 or 2 questions. And I'm really addressing those misconceptions. If I don't have time to mark in the moment, then it's shortly thereafter. Sporadically, I do give students a do now. So that's something that they'll get as soon as they come in the morning. And it's a really quick check-in just to see how students are feeling, where they are in the unit, and just in general. So there's a internal weather check, and it's for social emotional. And then also it has students self-assess their goals for the day. So it's action packed, and typically I plan for at least a block, although we do sometimes do it in one period. But pretty exciting time.
Yeah, I love setting those like mini goals for the day that really like sets the intention for the learning for the day. That's really awesome. Amazing. Let's go to Toni Rose.
Yeah, so in my classroom, we had so much fun. It was always just so much fun, right? So just kind of like what Kristi was talking about as far as the SEL check-in, that was where I had my students tell me stories. I taught 6th grade, so they had a lot of stories to tell me, and they wanted to just share all the tea about what was happening in their 6th grade lives. And so it was an internal weather check-in, and it was also just a way to just make sure that they were okay, right? Making sure that, hey, are you going to be able to be successful in today's class? And if that's not the case, that's also okay, because it's self-pacing, right? So really being able to check in with those students fairly quickly was really important to me. I also had a routine where as soon as they walk in the room, they look up, they see the pacing tracker, they see the agenda, they have the timer, and they have like shout outs as well as like a seating chart. I had flexible seating in my classroom. So students knew that they could sit wherever, but if they looked up and they saw that their name was on the board because they had to sit somewhere with a group, they knew to sit there. But they also knew that once they mastered the skill, or once they like surpassed whatever it is that they needed to work on, that they can move after that. So, and my students also knew Ms. D can make decisions, right? So like if you're going to move there and you're going to be distracted, Ms. D has all the right and the power to tell you to move if you are way too distracted. And so my students kind of really understood that. And so so once and that all happens like within what, like 2 minutes of the classroom, right? Like we've already covered so much in 2 minutes of my class, but then they were able to just kind of look at the pacing tracker and determine where they are. They set goals for that class time, and then they just kind of start where they left off, which is really beautiful. And as a teacher, I didn't have a teacher desk or an instructional nest. I had a stool, and I just walked around and sat beside students and had those conversations with them. There were times where I was working with students one-on-one, times when I was working with students in a small group, and times where I was just like admiring my classroom because it was just working really well, and they really didn't need me. They were very much advocating for themselves. They were self-directed learners. They knew where all the resources were, so that I wasn't the gatekeeper and I wasn't the only person that they would ask questions, right? So because I taught English, we read novels together, and we would do that together as a whole class. So there would be times where we self-paced, and then there are times where we did it as a whole group. So really depending on what the assignments were, I love the pacing tracker because there's transparency. They know how many lessons there are. They know what the summative assessments are. They know what the mastery checks are. They know what skills they're learning, and they really, really enjoy that because, you know, our students come in pretty anxious about what they're learning, and there's lots of like pop quizzes and things like that we used to do back in the day, but now it's just like a more safe zone, right? Like this is what we're learning, and this is the journey and the pathway to get to where we need to get. And so my students really, really, really love that. And so yeah, it would just differ depending on the day, but they all had a mastery check. I had a criteria for what mastery looks like. I did all the exemplars for what a mastery would look like, so that students knew I was also doing the work that they were doing. It wasn't just busy work. And so I knew going in, like, hey, I wrote this thing. Here's some misconceptions or assumptions that my students could potentially have. And also it took me 30 minutes to do this, so I know my students will take 90 minutes to do it. So like, how can I like make that a lot more intentional and shorter and more concise so that it's not taking that long? And so students, again, really appreciated that and respected the process, that I was also doing what I had asked them to do. And so that's just a little bit of an insight, but it's been a wild ride.
Amazing. Thank you. Yeah, at the moment we are still, desks and rows, but we're starting to see the inkling of flexible groupings again and whatnot. And it'll be just a breath of fresh air to start to like have that happen again, a little bit by little bit, flexible groupings outside for sure as the weather gets nice. Amazing. Next, let's hear from Karla. What does grade 8 world look like?
Oh, grade 8 world is fun. Hi, Matt, and hello, everyone. Welcome. It really depends on the subject, because I have now rolled Modern Classroom out in English, in math, and geography, and I am about to embark on some history with the Modern Classroom project style. One of the things that I will say is that at the beginning of each day, I will because I see my class for the majority of the day, I will work with the students to develop what's the structure of the day? What do we want the day to look like? What do we need in terms of like, what do you need more time at? Where do you need to like get support at? And then it really allows them to have a voice in where, and really letting me know like, oh, we really need some more time on this particular task. If we're rolling it out when I've rolled it out in math specifically, we would typically do like a minds on activity together as a whole. And then we would then break into where we would look at our pace tracker, where are we at? A majority of kids would check their understanding questions that would be assigned the previous day. And then are potentially ready for their mastery checks. And so a lot of times it was a lot of very quickness at the beginning, like, okay, getting mastery checks settled and getting that all figured out. And then they would just do wherever they left off. It's really dependent on the day-to-day. English was typically when we did, depending on the unit that we did, we just finished a novel study unit, which was unbelievably done. We did a book club in Modern Classroom. It was phenomenal. It was probably my best unit I've ever done with this particular. Math is really, because it really works, but the book club was phenomenal, and how I was able to sit and conference, and it was just, I didn't have to do really anything. Like I sat and worked with groups independently, and the kids just did their thing. So it really just depends on the class, but it's again, like checking in, where are you at? Mine's on a do now task, similar to Kristi. I would do like I'm using a lot of Mark Brackett's permission to feel and the mood meter at the beginning of the day, and kind of saying like, how are we feeling right now? So, stuff like that. But it really depends. And you know what, the beauty of it is that I've seen it both in the English and the math, the geography. There's not one size fits all. You do what you need to do at the time that you need to do it with what works for you. So you make it work to whatever you need. So that's all I gotta say for now.
Yeah, and I like how like it has a different feel in different subjects too, right? So that like it just, there's a different energy depending on whether you are doing book club or geography class.
Yeah, absolutely, Matt, for sure.
That helps with the dynamic of the day. All right, let's moving on to grade 9 English with Caitlin.
All right, thank you. So I will preface this by saying it is grade 9 essential English. So my classes are a little bit smaller. I have like flexible seating in my classroom, and all my students have technology because they all have IEPs. So my classroom looks maybe a little bit different than a traditional grade 9 classroom because I have some resources. So I would start my day with a minds on activity. So we all started together. My students in particular really loved Kahoots. So like someone would just get to pick like a Pokemon Kahoot, something fun, not subject related. And then I would post the on pace, so they knew where they like should-ish be. I didn't have like a tracker where everyone could see where everyone was, because the students in my class felt often like when they're coming out of elementary, they're always the kids who are behind. Right. And so I didn't want anyone to ever feel like they were behind. So I didn't want anyone to know where anyone else was per se. So I would have the on-pace tracker, and then they'd have their own game boards that they were going through. So they could like independently look and say, okay, this is where I'm at. I did have, though, because sometimes they wanted to reach out to students, I would have like star students. So-and-so has finished this mastery check and they were a star at it. So if you need help, you can go talk to this person. So there was still some collaboration happening in the classroom. talking really fast. Oh, because I'm in secondary, we use Brightspace. And so my game board did have hyperlinks in it to different Brightspace. Like the videos were all embedded in Brightspace. I use Google Assignments, so all of their practice and mastery checks were Google Assignments in Brightspace. And then because most of them in English, they're not handwriting, right? Because of accommodations. So they were doing their practice and mastery checks online on the computer. That meant too that I had a teacher desk, but I didn't stay there. I had a stool as well, like Toni, and I went around to each of my students to see how they were doing and where they were at. Google Assignments allowed me to pop in and do it secretively as well, but I went around to the class and checked in with them, and some days they wanted to sit in, like I was very lucky, I had like a little room off of my room with like really comfy chairs and lamps. So some days they wanted to work in there, and some days they were at their desks, but they could all just work where they wanted when they were at their own pace and when they were comfortable. And also because of the nature of the class, have like attendance issues. So that's was really lovely, because the attendance issues weren't lovely, but the fact that I was using Modern Classroom meant that I wasn't like reteaching a lesson just one-on-one to a kid each time they didn't show up, or it had been 3 days, so they didn't remember, so they could rewatch that video. And because they all have Chromebooks and I had headphones in the classroom, it was helpful because students were in such different places. So yeah, that's how my classroom kind of looked and how it worked in grade 9 English.
Amazing. Thank you, Caitlin. And lastly, let's hear from Sheri Hill.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, just to start off with a quick background, I've been teaching for 20 years, dabbling with computers, but teaching mathematics primarily. I suffer from anxiety, so I had this whole issue of doing this thing seemed really overwhelming at the beginning. So I understand if this sounds a little bit overwhelming yourself. But yeah, so what I did is I discovered and went through the program, and I was so excited. So what I see in my classroom now is kind of a mixture between the Modern Classroom and a little bit of what I've done in the past. So the kids walk into my class, they grab a whiteboard marker. I generally have about 4 or 5 questions on the overhead projector that they can try, and their focus is, I should focus on the questions that I'm struggling with right now. So the kids get to work and say, like, maybe I'm not great at this moment of solving an equation with fractions and whatnot. So they start on that. And since they're all just working away, the kids are like helping each other, moving around the classroom. It's that good chaoticness that's happening, which I really love. There's a lot of collaboration. And I use the tracker. So I do mastery checks on each kind of topic. So I keep track of every topic and how they're doing, and the kids can see that, and where I do a level of 1 to 4 and then R, and R just means to like review and retest. So it's kind of a fun way to have. But I haven't got to the short videos, but I do have videos for everything yet, because again, this moving to a Modern Classroom all in one step, I remember talking to a lot of people, and it's like, just try little things and bring it in. So the mastery checks are my main focus. The kids absolutely love the fact that when they write on mastery check, it's not going to harm them if they don't know it yet. And they said to me the other day, sometimes you just don't know what you don't know. So that was kind of cool to see, like, they're like, oh, I actually don't get this. So that was really fun. They get really excited when they're working in the class, because they know, like, oh my goodness, I didn't understand that in the last mastery check, so now I'm really going to work hard. And I know that my friend over there got it, so I'm going to wander over and talk about it with them. So it's a very movable classroom. And that's generally like the first 30 minutes of my class. Since I have video lessons, but not short ones, I do teach a short lesson. And then again, I let the kids be free after the lessons, where they can practice a new concept, continue teaching each other, or relearning concepts that they're looking to master. And my kids are totally doing a ton of coding on the side. So when they're a little bit ahead, they code. Some of the topics we're doing in class are just coding on the side, which I think is really awesome. So yeah, that's kind of a typical day in Ms. Hill's classroom. Thank you, Matt.
Amazing. And I love that explanation of mastery check, and that like relief of burden of like, oh, it's okay to get it wrong, and we can try it again. Like, what a load off, for you and the student.
Yeah, and they do ask, like, what do I have an R in? Because that's what I want to practice on today. So they're very excited to say, like, not what did I fail, but what do I need? What do I get to work on today? So I think that's really cool.
Mm-hmm. I just saw the question pop up, Sheri, so maybe we can address it right now. Are those mastery checks the same? Are they different? What do they look like?
So because I'm somewhere in the middle, every week or 2 weeks, I do about 5 different questions on stuff we've been learning. And I jump around a little bit. It's not one complete unit. It's like sometimes a volume of this and equations and exponents and internal or interior and exterior angles. And so they'll have those different questions. And some kids are really good at geometry and some are good at algebra. So they kind of like, I kind of throw them all at them on one day. This is what I've done so far. And then I'll give them a few days or so, and then I'll do a mastery check again on the students that need to master. And then after that, I'll individually hit the kids that I haven't hit. But I just found that was the fastest way to hit a bunch of kids at one time and then follow up with the ones that I haven't actually hit yet. Or maybe they're holding back.
Mm-hmm. Right. Okay, let's move on to another question then and dive into this model a little bit deeper. So what we'd like to know now is, how has the Modern Classrooms model addressed the needs of all of the learners in your class? So if we're thinking about our classrooms, we have so much learner variability in, I guess, both secondary and elementary. We have de-streaming, we have grade 9 math in particular this year. We also have our students who are our English language learners. We have students with special education accommodations. So how are we using this model, and how is this model helping us to address the needs of all of our learners? So why don't we start with Caitlin on this one?
Thank you. Yeah. So I kind of touched on it a little bit when I was talking about how it works in my classroom, but all of my learners in my classroom that I used it in had IEPs, and it was part of the reason I decided I wanted to use the Modern Classroom in that particular class. Was if you go through their free course, they use the term like on-ramp. It provides an on-ramp for all students. And I love that, because a lot of times with my students, whether it's because of ability or attendance, they don't have that on-ramp. If I'm working like, okay, today we're doing this lesson, and if you miss it, you miss it, right? Or I have to like find time to do it with you. So it allowed my learners, no matter where they were at or what pacing they needed, to get all of the must-dos at least, right? They could get all of that learning, and if they had to like revisit, they could rewatch the video, or I was more available because I wasn't trying to facilitate this whole lesson. I could sit down with them and I had time, and it became the norm. It wasn't weird that Miss Kemp was sitting with that one student, right? I was sitting down with everybody. So it allowed me to help all of my students, no matter. So I had some students who were quite far ahead, and I could challenge them with like those aspire to do's. But then I also had my students who were like, I just need to do these must do's. And I did make videos because I like videos, but they were able to like rewatch a video, or and I could like sit with them and like we could pause or whatever. So it allowed me to address like my kids who were having challenges getting to class, or students who had comprehension issues, and so they needed to review things over and over again. And then they were able to practice, and I could give them feedback, and then the mastery, right? So sometimes students in particular, like if everyone has to stay on pace at the same place, they don't get that opportunity to practice. They don't get that opportunity to try again, because they have to keep up with everyone else. And so it allowed me to help address everyone's needs in my class. I could also tell them, you know what, that you don't really need to do that lesson, right? Because in my head, I was like, you have to do these red ones, right? And they knew that too. You have to do these red ones. Don't worry about the orange and the green, right? If they're really struggling to keep up, right? And so they also could pace themselves as well, and they didn't feel like they were missing out on too much. So yeah, I think that the Modern Classroom, and it made me more available in the class, I think was the other piece too, right? Like I could sit down with the students a little bit more because I didn't have to teach the lesson or facilitate the group activity or pull like them for a class discussion. We still did some of those things some of the times, but a lot of English is talking about stuff sometimes. And if not everyone has read that part or understand, the discussion doesn't go well. So
yeah, a lot of that really resonated with me. I actually taught in the same pathway with Caitlin a couple of years ago. And I was doing almost a muddled version of Modern Classrooms without actually knowing that that's what I was doing. And so when I came across the model, I was like, oh, this is amazing in terms of providing that structure, and especially the must do, should do, aspire to do. Like I was doing those, but I was doing them on the fly. And so, yeah, what you're really saying about that is resonating with me, and I can see how valuable that would be, especially in that pathway. I mean, for all students, yes, but for that pathway for sure. Why don't we hear from Karla next?
Thanks, Rachel. Okay, so how would it meet the needs of all my learners? What's interesting is that in a grade 8 classroom, this year I have 23 students. And of those 23 students, I have a handful that are IEP. I have a handful that are really strong, independent learners. I have a lot with attendance issues, and all of their needs are getting met because they are this particular format allows them the time and the permission to do what they need to do to digest how they best digest the information. So the videos are amazing because what it does is it clones me. It allows the students to sit in class or at home and watch the video, and if they tune out, zone out, are away, they don't miss key learning, and they're able to go back, and sometimes they need to go back a few times. So that is a big component for it, for sure. The differentiation that it allows me is that, that piece of being able to go to certain IEP kids potentially and say, you know what, we're going to take this piece out. We don't have to worry about this today. And I can go, because I'm using Google Classroom, I can go into their slide deck and I can delete slides and unbeknownst to them. And so therefore I can remove that information so they are not getting super overwhelmed. So there's those components too. I have the time to sit and support. So I really, in the math, you're really able to see those kids that can really want to reach ahead. They can go. They've got this. They know what they're doing, and they go and they are continuing to do my may do tasks or my aspire to do tasks that I've given to them. And then I'm able to sit one-on-one and work with, a couple individual kids or just one individual kid, or whether it be for English, especially, like I was able to sit and go back and work with students one-on-one so often with feedback and writing and, tweaking this and what about this sentence, isn't this paragraph? And I was able to do that for almost all of my students. I don't have, the time normally I'm spending and lecturing for 30, 40 minutes. I don't have that time, but now I have that time back. And so now I'm giving it to my students and being able to collaborate with them on their writing pieces and being able to really reach them is just unbelievable. That one-on-one time that I get to give to these students that I would never have been able to do before.
Yeah, and time is so precious, right? As an educator. Yeah, I love that. Sheri, go ahead.
And I think I was just doubling up on that time thing. Like in high school math, sometimes we're teaching for 60 plus minutes, right? And it's insane. So if a kid asks you a question, you're like, well, I got to get back to this lesson. Like I don't have time for you. And I did have this one kid where I said, and he wasn't doing great. And I said, what can I do to help you learn? And he's like, no one's ever asked me that before. And I said, well, we're going to figure this out. So every day I had the time to sit with, okay, what are we going to work with today a little bit? And not it kind of like, I let him take the lead. And that's kind of like, why didn't it work today? Oh, I played on my phone too much. So there's a lot more reflection and connection happening with students, and a lot more time to work with students to fill in maybe missing math from the past, because the last 2 years have been pretty much of a disaster. So we're still doing the grade 9 curriculum of the de-streaming, but we're also going back and saying, oh, you didn't learn fractions. Okay, let's work on that one-on-one. And also on the other end, I have some students that are doing very well, and they said to me they love teaching other kids because they felt like they lacked social skills over the last year. So that gives them some kind of like way to talk to other people, feel proud of themselves, get to be a little mini teacher. So I think it just opens up time in the classroom, but freedom for kind of a lot more things to happen.
Yeah, really, really personalizing the learning. That's what I'm hearing there. So that's great. Thank you. All right, Rebecca, do you want to take away the next question?
Yes, I do. Sorry, I was processing all the great things I'm hearing. So we have the next question, and this question is: how does this model support building equitable classrooms that are safe and inclusive? And if I could ask Toni Rose to start for us, please.
Yeah, this is one of my favorite questions, only because I really like to create an inclusive and brave space for my students, right? When we talk about safe spaces, we can say that we think it's a safe space, but we really don't know. So I always try to change it up and say like, oh, I want to create a brave space so that students can be authentically themselves and speak up when they need to, and all that good stuff. And so with this model, we have those 3 pillars, right? So the blended learning part, it really allows for students to build that confidence so that they no longer are interrupting the teacher, asking for help, or feeling like a burden because they're not learning as fast or as quickly as their peers. And so with the blended learning aspect, there's videos that they can pause, they can repeat if they need to, or if they're like, I'm having a really awful day today and I cannot concentrate, that's also okay, because they're not going to miss out on anything, right? And so the learning now can happen outside of the classroom as well. And so it's no longer just in those 4 walls. And I don't actually control that, right? And so if students aren't there, if they're absent, or if they have a game or whatever life happens, right? They always have those instructional videos to catch them up. And so it creates this like really brave space for students to ask questions, to really learn the way that they're able to learn, and then also invite their families and caregivers to learn alongside with them. This one is my favorite part, only because I taught for nine years before I started implementing Modern Classroom. And a lot of the time, families and caregivers would be like, Ms. D, like, I don't know what you're teaching in class. I can't teach my kid the skills that you're teaching. And so now with the videos, it's like, oh, watch it alongside your child, right? Watch it alongside your student, and then you can kind of learn together. And so there's not a gap. The students are no longer saying, I don't know what we learned today. It's more so like, oh, here's an instructional video. Maybe we can sit together and figure out how to transfer these skills that I'm learning into this task that I'm doing. And so we had a question about students watching these videos. They actually watch it during class, right? And so my students know that if they cannot process it right now, they can also access it at home, and that's also okay. And students really love that. Like having conversations with multiple students are like, you know what, I do really well working at 1 in the morning. Okay, cool. That's on you. Like, that's great. Like you have that opportunity, but also know that you're going to utilize this class time the most efficient way that you can, right? And so that's the blended learning part of it. It's just being able to invite our families and caregivers, and even like the stakeholders, right? Our co-teachers, we're all on the same page now. There's not a gap or anything like that. Another thing is that, you know how in traditional, when we're doing lecture, we ask check for understanding questions, and we typically just ask like 3 to 5 students. In this case with the videos, you can embed those engaging questions and ask every single student to check for understanding. So it's not just 1 or 2 or the 3 most talkative, most excited learners. It's literally everyone now, where you're kind of gauging to understand like, oh, you don't understand this concept, so let's go back to it and have that conversation. And then with the self-pacing, again, we talked about the social emotional check-in. Like I love being able to know what was happening with my students right away. And so being able to build that in of just like, okay, what's your goal for today? How are you feeling? What's your goal today? What are you going to do to accomplish that goal? And to continue having that conversation. The pacing tracker was my best friend. I love that pacing tracker, and I utilized it as a way for students to collaborate with each other. It held the students accountable. But the beautiful part about the pacing tracker is that educators are held accountable. Like we cannot slack, right? Like as an English teacher, I can honestly say that I would have essays sitting on my desk for 2-3 weeks because I'm like, oh, I don't have time to grade these essays. But now that can't happen. And so just creating that space of just like, oh, you're turning something in, I'm actually going to take a look at it. It's not just busy work. It's going to be actually like, I'm going to give you feedback to keep you going. Because what I typically did before was that I said, okay, here's your essay, have fun. work on it when you get a chance. But with this model, there's time for revisions. There's time for reassessment. There's time for students to really digest and process all of the things that they could do better, and then all the things that they are doing better already. And so that's just one beautiful way about the revisions, with the self-pacing as well. And just being able to see students like really excel at certain skills and then really like make mistakes at certain skills as well. It's a very humbling experience for them, and that's also okay, right? We really embrace the revision process. We embrace the mistakes. So then again, this makes students feel brave enough to be like, oh, I messed up on this one, and that's okay. Perfectionism is no longer the goal. Grading is no longer the goal, but it's rather the feedback to make revisions, to make those reassessments. So then that learning continues, right? And so it just creates this space where students really are eager to learn, and it creates this autonomy as well to choose the lesson classification. So there's must do, should do, and aspire to do. So in my classroom, students knew the labels, and they knew that they could make the decision of when they're finished with their must do's, they could do the should do and aspire to do, or they could do other things where they're still learning, right? But with the aspire to do, what I did in the beginning of each unit was that I told the students, here's a one-pager, the skills, the summative assessment, everything we're covering for this unit. Now your job for this day, for this lesson, is to come up with an aspire to do. So then students are brought in, right? I mean, they're getting creative. They're like, oh my gosh, this is my idea. So of course I'm going to do this idea. So I want to get all my must-do's assignments done so that I can do this really cool thing. So it could either be creating a Minecraft world of the novel that we're learning, right? I mean, like things, because like I've come up with things that I thought were so cool before, and then my kids were like, nah, Miss D, like that ain't it. And so like I never want to spend that time ever again. So I just always included my students to be a part of that process, because then that means that, hey, this is their learning journey. Like they get to decide how this learning journey looks for them and what they can do to show mastery as well. And so now we're talking about mastery-based learning. There's time also, like if a student is struggling with a written component, let's talk about it verbally, right? Let's sit down and like, let's talk it out so that we can get you unstuck. And so just different venues of showing that mastery, because my time is open, I'm no longer speaking at students. I'm no longer trying to get Johnny to stop talking, but it's just more so like, oh, okay, like we need this time, and you're like, I know you know this. I know you know this. So show me the best way that you can show me that you've mastered this specific skill. And so this model is just like, it just creates a beautiful human being overall. Like I'm so like, I'll talk all day long about how my relationship building skills with students are on par. But before Modern Classroom, I could tell you what my kids are doing outside of the classroom, but I couldn't be completely honest about what they did academically because they were just all over the place. And then with Modern Classroom, I was just like, oh, like this student is doing all of this outside of school, and also they know all of these skills, and these are the things that they need more support with. And so I was able to see my student as a whole human being, and also as a student. And I just really, really, really love that. I was able to react when they needed me to react, or respond, or give them feedback, or whatever it may be. But it's just like, I've just really enjoyed getting to know my students, and they know that I'm there supporting them as a human being as well as a student. And so that to me is just like beautiful. So it's no longer just like, oh, I know this student does, plays basketball, does this at home, all of that. But I can also tell you that this student reads at this level, and like they know what a theme is, hands down. They can help anybody out with a theme and like whatever else. But like I felt like I knew my students as a whole person, which I was just like, oh my gosh, this is fantastic. And then I would always tell Emily too, as educators, we have data. And that I just always went over my head because like nobody's ever showed me how to read data. But now with like Modern Classroom, it's like, oh, this is actually really great, because then I see 80% of my students do really well. Now let's talk to these 20% of the students who didn't do so well and figure out what the misconceptions and assumptions are, or like, why did they make these mistakes? And so there was always conversations about mistakes, always conversations about revisions. And it just created such a welcoming space for students to just like enjoy, like, oh, I'm having a bad day today, so I need a moment, Ms. D, but like, I'm not going to interrupt the learning and teaching that's happening in the classroom. And that to me is just beautiful, because right, like learning, like our students being able to just embrace their learning is just, that's it for me. Like it's amazing.
I I want to echo Kristi and Yvette here. We all love your enthusiasm, Toni. This is great. Your energy is like popping out of the screen. So thank you for that. And I would like to say, you said some really, some things that I was listening, just popped out at me. And I want to say that you said, embrace the mistakes. And I'm not sure if this is or is not, but it needs to be on a t-shirt. I love that. So I'm going to go to Karla. So Karla, how does this model support building equitable classrooms that are safe and inclusive?
Well, there's just a couple things that I'm going to add or piggyback on. The embrace the mistakes piece, especially for those students who aren't used to making a lot of mistakes. Sometimes it's hard for them to be humbled. And so there's definitely a couple kids in my class that this had happened, and then they were like, and then they started panicking. I'm like, you don't need to panic. We get to go back. We get to remaster. It's take a deep breath. And so it's really teaching them and being okay with that part of the journey. The only thing I would add to that I haven't already talked about, because I've talked about the differentiation, I've talked about how it's really meeting the needs of the kids. When the students are absent, especially right now, like there's kids coming and going every single day. It doesn't interrupt their learning, but it also helps if I'm away. If I'm away, I don't have to worry about what I'm leaving for my supply, because I have built the lesson and they have the instruction, they have all the resources that they need, and the supply is like, is this for real? Like they're walking in and like, I'm still teaching the lesson. So it's a beautiful blend of everything that you can provide your kids. And even now, even if it's not necessarily a full-on modern classroom lesson, I still bring in the lesson in the lingo and the wording, and like there's that terminology that is embedded within our everyday practice. And I will oftentimes now, even if I'm giving an assignment that wasn't a modern classroom unit, I will still create a video so the kids have that as well, as just a different way to get the instruction that they need to meet their needs where they're at. All right, that's all I have to add to that. But because Toni Rose, she kind of nailed it and she was on a roll, so I wasn't going to interrupt that. So.
Thank you, Karla. And I do think it's important that you mentioned, I mean, we talk a lot about mental health. And I think when you do need to be away for whatever reason as a teacher, I think you hit the nail on the head there. Like what a relief for you to know that your class is going to carry on the way that it needs to, and you can manage whatever it is that you need to for your own mental health. So thank you for sharing all of that.
All right, so on to our next question. We're going to move on to collaboration in a modern classroom. So we want to know, what does student collaboration look like in the model and in your classroom? And specifically, maybe we can also pick up on especially one of the questions that's popped up in the Q&A about inquiry-based learning and project-based learning, and how this fits within our collaboration and our model as well. So why don't we start with Emily?
Cool. I love talking about this.
Yeah.
I think that a really important component of building a self-paced classroom using this model is designing for collaboration. So we can think about collaboration in two big buckets, like teacher designed and student organically led. I think that some people take the training, myself included, when I did the free course, and just thought like, oh, they're just going to all collaborate all the time because I have this tracker on the board. And that was not true. My 8th graders definitely needed some coaching and support in those areas. And so I have loved working with educators and getting pro tips on things like peer partnering, assigned peer partnering that's posted on the tracker for the day, just daily, of students who might be at the same pace in the unit. I've also seen teachers really leverage beautifully like whole group inquiry lessons at the very beginning of class before students jump into the independent work time and the instructional video time in the unit itself. I know that myself in my classroom, we would always do 10 minutes of independent reading. And that's when I did my SEL check-ins and I got their reading status. And then we did some kind of whole group writing together activity or some kind of grammar inquiry as a group for about 10, 15 minutes. And then we jumped into that more independent work. I think also just remembering like you're designing this unit, you are the educator still. And so you can make some lessons in your pathway and your learning pathway collaborative. Like to do lesson 5, you're going to be needing to work with a peer. I can help you make that happen, or you can make that happen for yourself. So really being intentional to leverage your agency as an educator in designing this unit to support collaboration. And also thinking like, even like Toni Rose was saying, like, well, how can mastery demonstrate itself in the context of collaborative or a different format? I saw students today actually in a biology classroom walking, they'd drawn a heart on the ground and they were walking the pathway of the blood on the heart and explaining it to each other. And that was their mastery check. So, you know, that is collaboration in action and shows really true and deep understanding of that particular concept. So there's so many things to think about with collaboration. I would say the most important thing is to think about those 2 buckets. Like, how can I facilitate it as an educator in the classroom? And then how can I really coach my students to be independent and finding each other just really organically? Like, what are the procedures and routines that they need from me to be able to do that organically?
I love that. And that really spoke to me as a science teacher. That pathway with the heart, that sounds amazing.
So cool,
I love
yeah.
it. Love it. All right. Why don't we hear from Kristi? I'd especially love to know what does collaboration look like in a grade 3 classroom using this modern classrooms model?
Well, as Emily was saying, it was designed in, I'm thinking back at the Summer Institute, and one of the opportunities we had was to consider and plan for collaboration, what that would look like. And some of that evolved into something else because of COVID protocols. So my ideal classroom with this math talk corner and all these sharing strategies, that's kind of on the back burner for now. But we still do a lot of math talk in the class, and using the model gives the students an opportunity to work with peers on the same concept. So they use the tracker to see who's at the same lesson within the unit, and then they can work alongside them. I often have them review their workbook pages with a peer as well. So they're sharing their strategies, explaining their thinking, and they're also, when they get to the should do's, those are typically games. So they're working with a partner or with a small group. The lesson consultants, they will circle back and they will help peers who are working on lessons who have, that they're slightly behind. And it's interesting because when I did with the launch, the Unit 0, students naturally and organically just kind of started helping each other, and it was lovely to see. And that's continued on its own. So it's lovely. We still do number talks. We still do play whole class games. We do scavenger hunts outside, but MCP is our base.
Yeah, I love that. Incorporating those whole class activities still and getting that collaboration. The math talks, in a science classroom, the science inquiry, and yeah, there's so many great ways to be able to bring everybody back together. And using that pacing tracker, not just for pacing, but for collaboration, and that your kids are knowing to look at that and to see where someone else is that they can go work with. So that's amazing. Why don't we also hear from Sheri? Because I know Sheri does some really awesome stuff with collaboration in her classroom.
I guess I kind of jump all over the place, but something that occurred to me when I was kind of thinking about this question was the naturally pairs that create, that I think you've mentioned before, but I like the student teacher to the student learner. And you ask, how do we encourage this? When I see it happening, I'll stop and listen, and I'll be like, oh, you totally understand this because you can teach it. And I think that's the Peter Liljedahl, like if you can make it to stage of teaching, then you've kind of mastered the skill of creationist afterwards. But I'll be like, you don't need to test on that. Like if you can teach it to someone, you understand it, that's fantastic, right? So it's kind of like the value of teaching something, or like you earned it. I do levels 1, 2, 3, 4. You earned a 3 before, but you totally understand it now. I don't even need to give you a new assessment. So to talk about the value of them teaching each other in the classroom, I think is important, the observation conversation. But I kind of wrote down here as you're talking is to get more collaboration, you have to give up control, right? So it's kind of like my kids were talking the other day and they weren't in math, and I was like, I wanted to tell them to get back on track. but a boy was talking to a new girl to joined our class a couple of weeks ago and said, "Where are you from?" And he was like, "Well, where in there?" And he's trying to figure out like Pakistan versus India and whereabouts and understanding the differences. And he was really genuinely curious. And I just thought that moment between those two is way more valuable than telling them to get back to work. So that the trusted relationships creates that ability to collaborate a little bit more, which I thought was really cool. And then something else I picked up, I do this with my grade 12s. I try to do the mastery-based testing with the grade 12s, which is a bit trickery, but I've embraced some assignments I give them. I learned through doing a lot of Indigenous studies is like, it should be reciprocated. Like I should learn from them. So I'll give them a topic and they get to research and teach me on it. And maybe you do that more in elementary, but less in math. Like, so it was like decibels in one group research, like the loudest room in the world versus the quietest room in the world, and presented this data to the rest of the class. And it was really amazing to learn from them. Like, I just don't think that we're the teacher, and they had to work together and collaborate. And I said, all your gifts are important. If you're the one that like does the pretty slideshow and you're the one that speaks more, and you're like, you don't all have to speak. You don't all have to be equal. It is really important to value your gifts. And I think it allows people to collaborate and be comfortable with who they are as a person. Thank you.
Yeah, that's a great example of incorporating Indigenous ways of knowing into your classroom. So thank you for sharing that with us.
Okay, so the next question, and I'm going to start with Kristi. What does feedback to students look like in your modern classroom? What are your revision and reassessment strategies that you use?
Feedback is most often immediate, which, you know, I have the opportunity to shift misconceptions in the moment, and rather than later, you know, when I get a chance to mark a test or what have you, when they've already moved on to something else. So when students come to the mastery check table and begin a mastery check, but it's evident that they're not quite ready for mastery, I have them review their guided notes, their workbook pages with a peer, or rewatch the video. And after, they'll return to the mastery check table for reassessment. And so most often I have the time at the mastery check table to ask those probing questions and help clarify thinking right in the moment, which is gold for me.
Thank you. Yes, I think a lot of us would agree, right? Having that time to just probe them a little in those conversations. And I've actually seen you do that in action, and it works very well. So thank you. And I'm also going to pose the same question to Karla, please. So what does feedback to students look like in your modern classroom? And what are your revision and reassessment strategies that you use?
So the great thing, similar to what Kristi said, is the immediate feedback that you're able to get. If it's in math class, you can pick up right away when they're doing the mastery check that, oh, we are not grabbing this concept and we need to like go back and, you know, relearn, rewatch, sit down and have some one-on-one time. When it comes to the, you know, for essay writing, or when it comes to writing, or just, you know, in English stuff, I'm able to read over and do that back and forth commenting and feedback with them. So by the time I actually read their final submission, I've already read their paper probably 10 times already. My marking has decreased. Like it is like I barely have any marking, and because it's happening all the time so quickly within classroom that I don't have the piles of marking loaded up. My mastery checks, you know, the data I'm collecting with each of my mastery checks in English, and it doesn't matter what subject it is, like I have the data on kids that I've never had before. And then I'm able to, when it comes to reporting time, like there's no question, I have what I need to have. And then the kids have that opportunity, you know, to go back and revise. And, you know, sometimes it's a conversation, but sometimes the greatest mastery checks are the ones that I sit and have a conversation with them about. Come over and let's chat about what we just learned here. Because it doesn't have to be pen and paper. It doesn't have to be on the computer. It can be just that oral conversation that you're having with them. And just by having that conversation, you'll pick up right away if they know what they're doing or not have a clue. And so just being able to just know your learners where they are at in that moment, at that right there at that time, and not 2 weeks when you have your unit test, it is a game changer in that regard for sure.
Thank you so much, Karla. And I really like that you talked about that you have time to do that feedback with the students. And I think every teacher's ears perked up when you went, I have less marking to do. And I think every administrator's ears perked up and went, data, give me the data. So this is fantastic. Thank you for sharing that.
Okay, so I think at this point, and I'm seeing a lot of the questions in the Q&A too, kind of addressing, starting up and like what does the on-ramping look like and things like that. So I'm I'd be curious to hear from our panelists, like maybe your biggest successes or biggest challenges with implementing the model so far, or some sort of or a piece of advice, that you would have for people who are intrigued and want to try to kind of dip a toe into some of this. So why don't we start with Sheri? Successes, challenges, advice, bestow us.
Oh goodness. I think one of my biggest successes is watching the change of attitude in students. Do you remember when they get a test back and then they'd scrumple it up and they'd throw it in the bin? I never see that anymore, ever. And they're just oh, I knew I didn't know this yet, but I'll work on this. And I think just this last week, a kid wrote a test last Friday, or 4 assessment or 5 assessment questions. And on Monday, I put those questions on the board in the morning when I come in or when they start, and I saw him writing it. I'm because I walk around with the tracker, I'm he had an R in this section. I'm oh my goodness, you can do this. He's well, I went home and tried to figure it out because I couldn't do it on the test. And I was that is exactly what we want. We want kids to figure out what they don't get and work on it. So that's one of them. And the other one, and I'll keep this short, is seeing the struggling students persevere. The kids that might have been the 30 or 40% and given up. And now they're oh, you mean I just have to study and I can go back? And then to figure out what studying is. One kid saying, oh my goodness, I did so horrible in that, but I studied all night. I'm but you only studied one night. Okay, so that's a great start. Okay, let's see where it got you. Okay, now let's go a little bit further. Because I don't think some of them know how to study, or and if you study and get a failing mark, that doesn't feel good. But if you study and say, I think they got a 1 or 2 and they were really excited about that, I kind of get it. So the perseverance. Biggest challenges is loud classroom. It's to me, because I'm a mom, or maybe because I'm a female, it's ooh, 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 but I have to I actually have a bell that goes off every day at certain times. It just says be mindful, and all the kids hear it, and there's some soothing music. And I'm just relax, just relax. And as soon as I relax, I can be okay, it's okay. And seeing the kids on their phone and realizing they're actually learning off their phone and not. So I've pushed myself to relax more. I wouldn't say I am. And last, I was completely overwhelmed, but the support from the Modern Classroom was just try one thing. You don't have to do everything. And I think there's lots that you guys are doing and I'm not doing yet, and I shouldn't feel guilty because I'm just doing what I can at this moment.
Yeah, I would totally echo that. Just do what you can. Go for done, not perfect. That's what we always say. All right, let's go to Karla.
Okay, I have a lot of challenges that I had for sure. It was a journey, right? But I would say the biggest challenge I had were my resistance students who were resistant to change, because they had mastered school. They had mastered how to work the system to get those level 4s, to get those A+, and do exactly what they were structured and taught to do for how many years before. And I threw all of that out the window when I not only rolled out Modern Classroom, but then I threw Gradeless at them as well. So for them, it was a whole, what is she doing to us? So I think for them, it was the resisting change and resisting the possibility of maybe there's something here to be said. And it wasn't until, because when I said, oh, we're going to roll it out in math now, and they're no, because they really like the way math is always taught. So then we rolled it out in math, and they're oh, this isn't so bad. And they actually really enjoyed it. And then we said, okay, so we're going to go back to traditional now, a traditional classroom for math. And they were like, oh my gosh, I think it was at that moment that they had their own aha moment that, oh, I get it now. Because you had those kids that were like, I just need to go now. I just need to get this done. And they couldn't, because no, we have to do this all together, just like you wanted, right? So I kind of played that game a little bit with them. The biggest successes, I would say, I had a lot of successes, and it was a journey that I did with the kids, because I always brought their voice into it. Like, help me make this better. What do you need to see happen? What changes do you think I should make? And always bringing their voices back and allowing them to help me structure it allowed for the successes that we would eventually have together. So it was a joint effort. But I would say the biggest takeaway is the behavior. I don't have behavior in my class. I don't have to worry about so-and-so off task, or so-and-so doing this, or so-and-so doing that. That's not an issue in my classroom. Everybody has a job to do. Everyone knows where they need to be and knows exactly who is doing what and where they're supposed to be and what they're supposed to be doing at this moment. There's nothing. So I would say that in itself, for some teachers, especially in elementary, because it can be crazy sometimes. And yes, the classrooms are loud, but they're doing what they need to be doing. So I would say that those are my biggest challenges and my biggest successes for sure. Thanks.
Amazing. Thank you, Karla. And let's move on to Kristi.
So Karla, did you see my head nodding like this? I kind of I had a tough time thinking about all the greatest successes. Picking one, because it's I agree with Karla. Like, I've brought the student voice all the way along, and this has been, I've been very humble with them and said, this is, we're starting something new, and it's going to be messy, but we are going to work together. And after every unit, I do a Google form and do a reflection, and I was, 87% shows this is their most preferred way of learning for this cohort that I have this year, and I have to have their buy-in, or it just doesn't work if I don't have it. And so, they're driving the bus, because I am a strong believer that they have to own their learning. I can't make them do it. And so, I wasn't worried about parents. I was worried about the kids. What do the kids think? If this is working for them, it's working for the parents. So, that was a huge bonus for us. Also, just thinking about, it wrote my learning skills, because it's a very independent program and it really reinforces organizational skills. Also, I have a pulse on every single kid at all times. I really don't need to do any unit test, because I know that they've mastered all the concepts along the way. And then when we consolidate at the end, that's just kind of the marking is super easy. There's not a lot there. As far as advice that I would give is that it can get messy, and that there is a lot of work in terms of front end loading. Pack your patience. But it's definitely worth it. Absolutely worth it. There's no turning back for me. I'm one of those, when Emily, we were showing that chart, the 95%, I'm in there. Count me in.
Amazing. Thanks, Kristi. And lastly, let's head to Caitlin for successes and challenges, and if you have any advice.
Mm-hmm. So I think I'm going to talk, because everyone's talking a lot about successes, so I'm going to talk about challenges and advice. So challenges, I was working with a group of students who was so used to not getting started until the teacher came and told them what they were supposed to do. Like they literally had, they were so used to the teacher coming and saying, this is what you're working on today. And that mindset change for them of like, well, you know what you're working on today. You have your tracker, check your tracker. Where are you at? You don't need me to get you started. I'm over here helping this student. So that challenge of getting them to take on accountability for their own learning, especially with COVID, there's been a lot of times teaching grade 9. So there's also that clash of starting high school and realizing, oh, if I don't do this, I don't go to grade 10. I really do need to actually take a responsibility for my own learning. So that was a big challenge, and just getting them into that new habit of okay, this is where I'm supposed to be, and this is where I go for my work. In terms of advice, Modern Classroom Project is very overwhelming when you look at it, and you're hearing these people who have all of these lessons and their mastery checks and they're planning ahead, and you're just trying to do day by day maybe right now. So Modern Classroom is really overwhelming, I think. And when I talk to staff, they get hung up on all these, like they think they have to do everything at once. You don't, right? You start small, start with like one video lesson maybe, or you do, you figure out your must-do, should-dos, and aspire to-dos. Just do mastery checks, right? Where like, it doesn't have to be all at once. Just dip your toe in and try it, and then slowly get going. And another thing is, like, I sometimes like to be spontaneous, and that was something that I had reservations about with Modern Classroom. I was like, oh, it's gonna all be planned ahead, and students are gonna be always working by themselves, but you can still like be like, okay, pause, we're gonna do this today, and like you can still have spontaneity and have class discussions and debates, still have group stuff. So like, yeah, that like it doesn't have to look the same as everyone else's, and I think that's what we're hearing from the various panelists. All of our classrooms look a little bit different. Yeah, so that's what I have to say.
Amazing. Thank you, Caitlin. And I realize we're sort of butting up against time, so I'm going to throw it to you, Emily and Toni Rose, if you have like a 30-second quick tip before we have some exciting kind of like learning opportunities to share after that, before everyone goes. Emily, to you first. 30 seconds, a quick tip.
30 seconds. Yes, I would say there's no one right way to run a modern classroom. That's my advice to you. You have to make it work for you and your students. And also just remember the purpose of this model. The purpose is to help you differentiate and personalize instruction so you can meet the needs of all your students. That's the purpose. And that's what matters most. And when all of our students are succeeding and growing, then the model is working. So even if you're not doing every component, the model is working. So that's what I'd say. Be gentle and start small, and yeah.
And that was 27 seconds. Perfect. And Toni Rose.
I think for me, just convince your teacher bestie to do this with you, because it is so much more fun when you are doing it with someone as opposed to you being by yourself. So convince your teacher bestie, find a teacher bestie and do this journey together, because again, it's just that much more fun when you do it together.
Perfect. And that leads so perfectly into what we're about to talk about next. So
yeah.
Thank you for that.
Don't run off yet, because we do have some important information for you that you definitely don't want to miss. So first off, in true Modern Classroom style, if you want to learn more, we do have some resources for you that you can go check out. So your must-dos is to go and register and work your way through that free Modern Classrooms course. You don't have to do it all in one go. It is self-paced. It is amazing. It doesn't take too long to go through the learning, but it's definitely a must-do. Your should-dos is, as a shift coaching team, myself, Matt, and Rebecca, we are all available to help you. You are not alone. So you can connect with us. We are happy to brainstorm with you, co-plan, support with the tech tools, whatever support you need, we are here for you. So all you have to do is reach out, and we can support you in any way. And then finally, the Aspire to Do's. Go join the Modern Classrooms Facebook group. I think there's over 9,000 educators. At least that's what I think I heard on the podcast the other day. It is amazing in terms of the resources and the collaboration that's going on in there. There's also mentors who are often in the Facebook group. It's moderated. So lots of really, really good information there. And if you want to hear more about Toni Rose, and you want to hear Toni Rose's voice more often, then check out the podcast. And the energy does come out through the podcast as well. So it's amazing to listen to.
And we have another exciting opportunity to announce too. Someone earlier on mentioned the cost of the mentorship program. Well, we have some spaces for small teams, as Toni Rose mentioned, your teacher bestie to attend the Virtual Summer Institute, which is the mentorship program condensed through the summer. So if we're looking for teams of 2 to 3 educators that are excited by learning this evening and trying to try out the MCP in their school for next year. And it's a super practical, you can plan the first little bit of September when you get back, and just be ready to launch in whatnot. So so this could be a grade team, a course team, a subject team, and some other kind of team that we're not aware of. We're also hoping to have some other learning opportunities this fall to support this cohort as well. Hopefully, finally, with some release time. Fingers crossed on that one. So if you have a small team that is interested in the work, there is the feedback form and the interest form for the Summer Institute for a chance to be selected for this unique opportunity, and we'll cover the cost for that. And as well, we're always welcoming your feedback on what you thought of this evening and the format of this Shifting in Action. This is a new format for us. So if you're willing to share your feedback on the event, how we can go from good to great, please do so on the same form. If you do fill in that feedback, you'll be entered into a draw for a chance to win some awesome Shifty swag and mugs and t-shirts and the like. So yeah, go do it. Do it now.
Okay, thank you so much for being here. Coming out in the evening, we just appreciate it so much, and we really hope that it was valuable for you, and that I'm sure you had to have taken away something wonderful to think about. But we also want to extend a great big thank you to our very passionate, wonderful panelists for sharing and basically inviting us into your classrooms in a virtual way. And thank you so much for your time. And with that, we'd just like to ask the panelists to hang on while we send off our guests. But in true Halton style, feel free to unmute and say goodbye, and we'll see you next time.